This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tim Eckott. Good news about the marine environment sometimes seems as rare as ambergris. The oceans are notoriously hard to study, and much of marine science remains at times built largely on guesswork or isolated studies that tell us a lot about one species or one small area of the marine world, even though 2/3 of our planet are covered by the sea. Barbara Bloch is an American scientist who's trying to build a bigger picture of one marine ecosystem, the Pacific coastal region of the USA, which stretches from Alaska all the way down to the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. She's just been given a prestigious Rolex Award for Enterprise for a project which will allow the public to follow the movements of some of the most exciting oceanic wanderers, the seals, the whales, the sharks and seabirds, as they travel around an environment so rich she calls it the Blue Serengeti. By allowing the public to track the movements of these amazing animals and fish, Dr. Bloch hopes they'll become engaged with the idea of conserving them and their healthy habitat for the future. Just after the awards were announced in London, I caught up with Barbara and asked her what her project hoped to achieve.
I'm trying to connect animals in the sea to humans. Basically, we're going to be using electronic tagging technology, acoustic technology, in which an animal carrying a tag is going to send out data underneath the sea, and we will pick up that data at predator cafes through a receiver underwater that then links to Iridium and cell network, sends the data back to my lab, and I'll send it to your mobile. The goal is to introduce off the western shores of North America the idea we have a blue Serengeti, an area teeming with sharks and tunas, turtles and seabirds, and we want to basically hook up the public to this wild place.
How do you engage the public with marine conservation? Because it's often the poor relation in conservation terms, because people find it hard to empathize with particularly fish.
Well, we've heard that over 90% of the fish have been fished out of many areas, but in California, across the California Current, which runs from Canada to Mexico, we're beginning to realize we have an intact piece of ocean, almost pristine, that hasn't been overfished, and it's our goal to engage the public with data showing their migrations in a timing that goes from spring to summer, where they move inshore and then go offshore, and try to tell their stories, the animal stories. These animals we're studying, we've tracked for over 25 years. They have names such as Slash, Tipfin, and if we tell the white shark story one by one, we're hoping to engage our North American colleagues in the fact that we have predator cafes. They're worth actually paying attention to and saving.
Now, obviously, people can get excited about a big, charismatic creature like a white shark, but you're not just tagging sharks, are you?
No, we're tagging tunas, seals, whales, sea turtles, and seabirds. So whether it's an albatross journey that might be 2/3 of Earth, or whether it's a whale that's going from California to Mexico and back, these animals, yes, they're the charismatic megafauna, but through their journeys, through their sojourns, we hope to basically engage the public in the idea that we have a Yellowstone, an ecological ecosystem that's not been tipped, that's actually intact, and we want to understand why. How has this place avoided the fishing, the overexploitation, the climate variation? What is it about the system that keeps it so healthy? And it seems that the predators are making it stable.
Do you have any rough ideas or theories about why it is so stable?
I have a feeling that what's going on the eastern boundary current, which is what the California Current is, on the eastern side of the Pacific Basin, is that we have intense upwelling that has brought the animals right up against the shore. I can see from my office window whales who are blowing. I can actually go out, catch white sharks an hour from my house. And it appears that the upwelling is so intense there that it's brought the animals inshore. But as these animals wander away thousands of miles on their journey to the central Pacific, they become the target of longliners coming from multiple nations. There is no treaty that protects them in the Pacific. It's a Wild West. And so we have to get their stories out now before it's too late.
I mean, this is one of the big problems of marine conservation, isn't it? That fish, sharks and whales travel big distances, particularly the predatory species you're talking about. And once they leave a protected area, they're fair game for anybody on the high seas.
How we protect these places in which international boundaries are not really respected by fish is by creating, we think, dynamic protected areas. We recognize the foraging hotspots, the breeding hotspots, and we put on types of technology that's cheap, such as the acoustic tags that ping and say I'm here, and show that we can electronically monitor our seas. Once we've done that, we need to then get governments to comply and work with us to actually limit quotas, use electronic technologies for surveillance, and recognize that we have the capacity in the 21st century with the same chips that come in our computers and satellite phones to actually follow these animals and preserve them for the future generations.
Buried in your answer there was this idea that you could get governments, international governments, to comply. The record in marine conservation is pretty poor on that score, isn't it?
I think that we're coming of age and recognizing that we've tipped the balance in many ecosystems. The Grand Banks, for example, or George's Banks, once were dominated by cod. They're now dominated by lobster and mollusk. I think at this point what we're considering are things like carcass tags. That's my dream tag, where every tuna in the sea has to wear something equivalent to a clothing tag so you can't, quote, steal it from the ocean. And I believe in the next decade we'll move to electronic monitoring, and we'll have to work hard to get Asian nations to comply. But I think the bigger picture is we need a blue revolution. And I think we're reaching a point in the seas where we can't take the wild fish from the seas at a level that supplies the protein needed by an Earth with 9 billion people. So we have to find the species that are best raised in captivity, and then we need, as a globe, to actually work together to produce those species, to feed the protein from the sea that's so good for us, and do it in a sustainable fashion.
Why do people find it so hard to get engaged with protecting fish and the sea?
Well, I don't think we as conservationists have been able to make the charismatic megafauna as easy to save as a panda or a tiger. But if you know giant bluefin tuna like I do, these are animals that Aristotle and other scientists before me actually felt very strongly about. There's art that shows us that the coins of Romans, Celtic coins, Phoenician coins, all were stamped with bluefin tuna. So I have to hold those coins in my hands. I own a few. And I wonder why our generation of life on Earth doesn't see this animal and revere it as prior generations did. This is an animal that built the Mediterranean civilization. So what we have to do now is actually raise the bar for these beautiful animals with form and function that's gorgeous. They're warm-bodied like us. The white sharks, the makos, the salmon sharks, their relatives called the mackerel sharks, are all endothermic like we are. So it's time for us to not eat shark fin soup, to consider the sustainability of our sushi. There isn't an endless bounty in the sea.
Tell me a little bit of good news. I mean, the area that you're talking about, the Blue Serengeti, as you call it.
Well, the Blue Serengeti is off the coast of California, the most populous state in our union. It stretches from Canada to Mexico, really all the way up almost to Alaska. What we have is an upwelled system rich in anchovy and sardine that goes through many climate perturbations, El Nino, La Nina, Pacific decadal oscillation. These are large switches of the currents from warm to cold, and perhaps being hit by this large set of temperature variations has given this area a bit more buffer, a bit more resilience that allows this ecosystem to remain intact. And most of all, Americans on this coast haven't fished very heavily in this region on these animals, which has preserved this group of large pelagic predators.
Are you worried that the fishing industry will wake up to the fact that there are lots of fish there and that they may come under pressure?
Well, currently they are coming under pressure to the south in Mexico. And the Americans who've settled in this region aren't big fishers. They're not from the cultures that are fishing the tuna. But for sure, it could happen. The reason it hasn't happened is the California coast is very steep. It's actually a very dramatic shelf. It's very difficult conditions out there. It's almost a wild place. And as our continent abuts the Pacific there, the shelf is so severe that it makes it very challenging for people to actually find these animals.
But fishing technology continues to improve. I mean, it's not the sort of chance activity that it was for thousands of years of evolution in human terms, is it? I mean, the satellite technology, the way they map the seabed, it sounds as if the fish stand very little chance if the fishermen decide they want to go after them.
Well, the good news is that even we as scientists with our sophisticated technologies are still having trouble understanding what sets the pace on the comings and goings. If we learned one thing over the past 10 years on the California current, it's that we have homecomings. We have homecomings that happen in the spring and the summer and the fall, slightly different timing between mako sharks, white sharks, elephant seals, and tunas. And what we're trying to figure out is the internal clock. What is it that's pulsing the animal's movements? It appears to be seasonal, temperature related, could be the sardines they're eating on coming up from the south. So we're still unable to actually get that timing down. As we improve our understand how the animals are moving, we have to be proactive, put in the protections that will be required, because if we're going to let the public in on where the hot spots are, we have to do it with the knowledge that there will be fishers trying to fish those animals out.
Tell me a little bit about the Rolex Award and how you will use the grant money that brings.
The Rolex Award forced us to think outside the box. And the outside the box for us is to say we've got a decade of beautiful digital data stored in our computers that no one's seeing. And what really moved me was to publish in Nature a story about this blue Serengeti, to suggest we could make a World Heritage Site and then have people say, well, that would be quite hard, wouldn't it, in the 21st century to do that? So what I want to do is link people to the predators, create these cafes, which will be pretty much social networks between white sharks and the public, between animals that we have long-term tagging data and the internet, and through mobile apps, we're actually going to let our whole tagging database out and publicly stream it.
In effect, you need a big PR exercise, don't you, to make people fall in love with marine predators?
That's exactly right. And so what you can hear from our Rolex tale is that that's what we're doing. We're saying, let's connect people to the sharks. And what I think I'm realizing in Monterey Bay is if you walk down the street and you said to the average citizen, do you know there's leatherback sea turtles and white sharks right outside our doors here? It's outside the windows. They wouldn't know that. And so what I need to do is engage the public with what it means to have intact ecosystem. We've protected the Great Barrier Reef, but it might be harder to protect something like large pelagic predators. So the Blue Serengeti Initiative really is trying to bring in Africa to say we understand where the watering holes are, where the lions, the cheetahs might come around a common place. We understand where the wildebeest might be along a highway. Let's see if we can show you those places that we've already mapped out. We know where they are, and see if that helps connect people to their predators in their backyard.
Do you think you run the risk, though, of confusing the public? Because we're constantly being told that this species and that species in the sea is on its last legs, that in 10 years they'll all be gone, the coral reefs are dying, and now you're saying you found a Serengeti just offshore, one of the world's most populated countries, one of the most developed economies, and that there's actually some good news out there. Isn't that going to make a lot of people think, oh, well, we don't need to worry?
That's an excellent question, but we need to consider that the Pacific is 2/3 of Earth, so it's a very big ocean. I'm talking about a tiny piece of the Pacific Ocean in the eastern realm. I think the good news is there are a few hot spots that are still intact, but the bad news is most of the oceans have been overfished, most of the oceans have suffered large-scale, large pelagic or large open ocean fish decline, and that this tiny bit of good news from the Eastern Pacific doesn't make up for what's happening on most of the planet.
That was Dr. Barbara Bloch of Stanford University in the USA, one of this year's winners of a Rolex Award for Enterprise. I'm Tim Eckott, and you've been listening to The Voice of Russia from...
And we will pick up that data at predator cafes through a receiver underwater that then links to Iridium and Cell Network, sends the data back to my lab, and I'll send it to your mobile. The goal is to introduce off the western shores of North America the idea we have a blue Serengeti, an area teeming with sharks and tunas, turtles and seabirds, and we want to basically hook up the public to this wild place.
How do you engage the public with marine conservation? Because it's often the poor relation in conservation terms, because people find it hard to empathize with particularly fish.
Well, we've heard that over 90% of the fish have been fished out of many areas, but in California, across the California current, which runs from Canada to Mexico, we're beginning to realize we have an intact piece of ocean, almost pristine, that hasn't been overfished, and it's our goal to... Using animals and fish, Dr. Bloch hopes they'll become engaged with the idea of conserving them and their healthy habitat for the future. Just after the awards were announced in London, I caught up with Barbara and asked her what her project hoped to achieve. I'm trying to connect animals in the sea to humans. Basically, we're going to be using electronic tagging technology, acoustic technology, in which an animal carrying a tag is going to send out data underneath the sea.
Ecosystem, the Pacific coastal region of the USA, which stretches from Alaska all the way down to the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. She's just been given a prestigious Rolex Award for Enterprise for a project which will allow the public to follow the movements of some of the most exciting oceanic wanderers, the seals, the whales, the sharks and seabirds, as they travel around an environment so rich she calls it the Blue Serengeti. By allowing the public to track the movements of these amazing... This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tim Eckott. Good news about the marine environment sometimes seems as rare as ambergris. The oceans are notoriously hard to study, and much of marine science remains at times built largely on guesswork or isolated studies that tell us a lot about one species or one small area of the marine world, even though 2/3 of our planet are covered by the sea. Barbara Bloch is an American scientist who's trying to build a bigger picture of one marine